We do have a couple of questions in the chat, but I'd like to just kick off and pick up your point, Stephen, about holistic and genuine strategic thinking. So perhaps Stephen, and love to hear Mike's viewpoint too on how were the numbers so wrong? How were the projections so out of pace that population growth numbers were reached decades before they were planned, and there was none of that holistic forethought given to the jobs and the education centres? We know it happens, but would be grateful for your thoughts, Mike and Stephen, on how can we stop that happening again and again?
It's an interesting observation, and I think I put it down to one of my predecessors here was a chap called Eric Lumsden. Eric was the CEO that also went on to head the planning department at WA, and then went on to be the chair of the Development Commission. During his tenure, he developed a plan called Directions 2031. We didn't have a good, solid understanding of what Perth's growth corridors were going to look like on all the infrastructures we planned around it. Most of Perth during the 1990s, perhaps prior to that, was being developed really by the developers. And they had the opportunity, the land was easy to develop, you could roll out another sand dune, and we didn't have this strong centralised core of planning considerations. I think the other thing that goes wrong is when a local government also fails to look strategically at its land use. If I put up that graph of just the population growth again, when you add an extra 1,000 people, you don't notice a difference. When you add another 5,000 people, you might notice a difference. But all of a sudden, there's 20,000 people and the local roads haven't coped, and then you're wondering, well, where did they all come from? So the central function that we as local government have in coordination of bringing the state back into that same journey and making them deliver and coordinate infrastructure. They're things that right now are serious challenges, but they were ignored largely back in the 1990s.
Yeah. Mike, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. I'd echo Stephen's comments there that I think it's a state responsibility. It's interesting just talking to Stephen and his team in the last few days. It's a bit of a revelation to me because in the early days, we were pioneering, putting the 10,000 lots up there north of Nangara Road. And at the time, there were quite a few environmental constraints as well, because there were some land swaps that occurred there. The perception was that it was very environmentally sensitive. My understanding also was that we had the Nangara water mount, so we had an underground water pollution control area or groundwater solution that complemented the reservoirs. I think that the overall complexes or the context has changed significantly over those 20 or 30 years, but definitely it's something I think it could have been addressed a bit more closely at the state level. But again, in hindsight, it's easy to sort of go back and sort of say these things should have been addressed. But yeah, look, in those days, there was just wasn't even comprehended that it would be anything more than that. So yeah, I tend to sort of agree with Stephen in that respect that, we need to do as much forward planning as possible, but I think it needs to be at all levels of government. So definitely the state, needs to come to the party, and even the federal government, because I think that Perth to Darwin freeway, that level of infrastructure going in would sort of maybe change the context as well.
Can I push then a little bit on that responsibility of state government? Well, they obviously saw the need for a train line, but it took an extra few decades to arrive than expected. And what sort of impact would that have had? And one of the questions that come in is around, would that have facilitated greater density along that line if it had come earlier?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've just completed a strategic business case for the high-speed rail between Sydney and Melbourne, and the notion of 8 new cities. And the chairman of that group, Nick Cleary, saw the plan in the office a few months back, and he said, "Mike, just imagine if that transit corridor had been in there from not day one, but at least in the first decade, how differently it might have been configured in terms of." I noticed the question too asked about commercial and retail, but I see more, key worker housing, density, more medium density housing. you touched on East Perth and Subiaco, you know, they're really quite instructive examples, I think, that are held up now nationally as exemplars. I'm sure we could have learnt some lessons from Subiaco and East Perth. And this is the whole thing that we're constantly debating is, you know, why can't we, you know, emulate the urbanism of the inner neighbourhoods in the growth areas? You know, we've got some really good reference points there. Our forebears had the foresight to lay out, you know, true mixed-use, compact, walkable urbanism, you know, based on transit. Why aren't we doing that, you know, in a contemporary sense in the growth areas?
It is an interesting issue, you know, the old chicken and egg question. I think we'd all love to have seen the Ellenbrook train line in there much earlier than we would, and perhaps we could have got some further density developed along the core of the line. I mentioned that Whiteman station. Could you have had those population cells developed already prior to going out beyond Ellenbrook now to northeast and northwest? There is a significant constraint in the economy at the moment, and that relates to vertical construction. So this is the other challenge we're seeing in Perth. I'm sure Mike, other states are as well. It is very expensive, and several Perth building companies that specialise in that area have now gone into receivership. So we're still finding it hard to get those high-rise developments off the ground. It is still relatively cost-effective to build a single residential dwelling. Building 3, 4 or more stories is expensive, and developers just aren't prepared to do it at this point in time. So if that's the constraint, where do we put the people in the interim? Well, we have to put them into these single residential homes, because if we don't find more way of accommodating Australia's population, we're in real trouble.
You're absolutely right. And, you know, all of the targets that have been set by the federal government are seeming to be almost impossible at the moment, given the state of the economy, of supply side constraints of the construction sector. And I think we do have a long way to go. And what I'd be really interested in, we have another question there about outer suburban study hubs, which is a new initiative of the federal government. And Stephen, you mentioned perhaps no need for a university campus at this stage, but definitely a TAFE. And I suppose I want to get to that point of thinking about future-proofing. So yes, maybe not a need for a university campus at the moment, but those population projection figures show that there will be a need for one relatively soon. How early in that journey can we start advocating? And why does it seem, maybe it's just the world I live in, but why does it always seem to come back to local government to have to really advocate and fight for these really essential infrastructure and services?
You're actually going to steal some of our thunder, Ron, because we are working on a regional study hub bid at this juncture.
Good.
The days that I went back to university, or at least first went to university, required the bricks and mortar solutions. You travelled to campus, the technology was limited. I'm prepared to admit, in the 1970s, a computer could only handle so much information. 10,000 word thesis took the entire computing sector's capability to deliver. So technology has been a key enabler now in the way we handle and deliver a tertiary education. You don't need to have a large-scale bricks and mortar facility, but you need to have spaces where people can come, interact, communicate, and I think that's where these outer metropolitan study hubs come. So we are looking at one for Ellenbrook. We are partnering with a provider. We're modelling ourselves on what has been done in a number of other locations. That would be an interim step, but again, that's for a certain type of tertiary education, those who want university-based degrees. We do need to look at trade training facility. And again, the nearest trade training facility is down in Midland. Is the solution that we expand that site, or do we need a trade training facility out at Ellenbrook? Healthcare, particularly, you talk about that issue of staging for education. If we had a primary healthcare facility of reasonable scale in Ellenbrook, could it continue to grow? It's never going to be a tertiary hospital, but could it be an advanced health campus, similar to the way the Joondalup story gradually evolved? I think that's part and parcel of Ellenbrook's need, but at the moment there's no site for it. Where should it go? How do we get the state government interested in saying that should be part of its health plan?
Yeah, interesting. It seems to be almost insurmountable sometimes, doesn't it, when you think of all of these areas that people need, all of these items of infrastructure and service delivery that people need. And as we are in this housing push, we don't really talk about that. We don't hear state and federal government talking too much about infrastructure and services, just about houses. And, you know, I think that's a really big risk that in this major push that we're all in, we might end up with a worse outcome than we could have imagined. But any final comments from Mike or Stephen before we wrap up and move on to the next presentation?
Look, I'll make one if I could, and just pick up your last point. I think that's where the real importance of local government planning comes in. You take health, for instance. The health model is one where it's shared between state and federal government. Federal government doesn't operate hospitals, but the state government does, but the federal government funds predominantly hospitals. So when you're trying to get the attention, it's essential for local government to have looked at not just taking Mike and the village, but ask that question, around all these villages, where are all these other services going to go? And to be strong in your advocacy for what you need.
Yeah.
Cast your eye to the future as often as you can, and then at least you're starting to think about some of these bigger problems.
Yes.
We work well with the development industry, but with respect to many of those in that industry, their focus on profitability is about getting a lot developed, sold, and moving on to the next development, because that's what the industry does, and it creates a lot of employment. It's essential that local government be strategic and local government be leaders.
Great, thanks. And Mike?
So, yeah, Bronwyn, just a party comment from me, just mainly more of a comment and an observation for Stephen. We haven't had a chance to talk about this, but in the early days, we actually contemplated being, you know, having a closed loop. So in terms of the services, to contain them on site, so, you know, like a package treatment plant, and to, you know, have our own sort of sewage system. And what happened was the Water Corporation, in their wisdom, saw fit to, you know, pump it across to the coast. I'm just wondering if we are going to go to 150,000 people, whether we could be, you know, a little bit more self-contained in the way that we are, you know, configuring up this new urban centre. I think the more that we can be self-contained and think about, you know, a much more sustainable pattern of urbanism, the better off we might be.
It's very much on our agenda right now, Mike, and that's as we're now using this opportunity to say, well, how do we connect all of those bits around Ellenbrook, the power, the water, the sewer? Those are direct engagements we have, and we're doing it very collaboratively, particularly with UDIA, our Urban Development Institute.
Excellent.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Stephen and Mike. Really appreciated those insights and that conversation, and I'm sure that's, well, I know it's given me a lot of ammunition to take forward in our advocacy work at NGAA, and I'm sure it has also given a lot of our audience and other NGAA members some ideas of what has worked and what needs to be considered in this more holistic strategic planning. So thank you.